Alice, I just want to say welcome.
Nice to
Well,
meet you.
good morning, everyone. Good morning. One of the great privileges of being the rector of Church of the Holy Communion is introducing guests into the Rector's Forum, particularly this semester when we've had so many of our city's leaders as we explore questions related to the commemoration of Dr. King's martyrdom and civil rights in our city. Today is no exception. Terri Freeman came to Memphis in November of 2004 to serve as the president of the National Civil Rights Museum.
14.
2014. You're much more experienced than all of that in that role. Came in November of 2014 to serve as the president of the National Civil Rights Museum. In this role, she is the chief steward of one of Memphis's greatest treasures. Shortly after Terri Freeman's arrival at the Civil Rights Museum, the Reverend Dr. Doug Lind, a visiting priest at Church of the Holy Communion, made his first visit to the Civil Rights Museum and described it as the most moving experience he had had since visiting Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Ms. Freeman is also one of the leading voices and lead planners in Memphis's commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's martyrdom, and it's a delight to have her at Holy Communion as a part of our observance. Just this weekend, Ms. Freeman spoke on a WKNO panel that explored the progress that Memphis has and has not made on poverty issues since Dr. King's death. She's on the cutting edge of poverty and justice work in Memphis, and we're honored to have her here with us. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Terri Freeman.
Thank you so much. All right, well, good morning. Wow, it did fill in. It really did fill in.
It will still.
It will still, huh? Well, thank you so much, Reverend Webb, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be with you this morning. It is truly an honor. Now, I must say that I'm not really a stranger to the Church of the Holy Communion because my daughter graduated from St. Mary's last year. She was here for 2 years. We moved here in 2014, and she actually joined me in 2015, her junior year in high school. You can imagine how well that went over. I think we actually, she wrote me a letter. They have the girls write letters to their parents as they're headed off to college, and you don't get them until after they're actually in college. And she let it rip in the letter. But she says she still loves me, and she calls every month for money. So I'm assuming that I'm still an important person in her life. But again, thank you. So I'm familiar with this space. My mom is here with me, Mrs. Barbara Cheney. She is my biggest fan, and that's why I bring her along, because in case nobody else likes what I have to say, I can always be guaranteed that I'll get "oh, you did great" from my mom. So Reverend Webb told you a little bit about me and how I got here to Memphis. I got to Memphis by way of Washington, D.C., by way of Dayton, Ohio, by way of Detroit, Michigan, by way of my birth home, Chicago, Illinois, which is where my mom is from and where I was born and raised. I went to college and, well, she remarried and moved me my senior year in high school. So I used to tell my daughter, look, 11th grade is a piece of cake. I had to move in my senior year of high school. And we moved to Detroit, and then I went to college in Dayton, Ohio, University of Dayton, go Flyers. And then I went to grad school in Washington, D.C. at Howard University, HU, and got stuck and stayed in D.C. for over 30 years, and that really became my home. So I had a very thriving job in the field of philanthropy. A friend of mine who works in Silicon Valley calls those of us who were employed in philanthropy philanthropoids, not philanthropists, because we didn't have the money. We actually played with other people's money. So I served as a philanthropoid and ran a corporate foundation for many years, and then went on to lead the community foundation for the National Capital Region in Washington, which served D.C., suburban Maryland, and Northern Virginia for 18 years. And 18 years is a long time. And I believe that every good leader asks the question every year, are you giving your absolute best to this work? Is this what you love? Is this what your passion was? And so it was beginning to get to a point where I felt it was time for a change, but I wasn't actively looking for anything. And then this opportunity presented itself. And it just felt so right. People ask me all the time, well, did you have family here in Memphis? Nope. Had you visited Memphis? Yes, when I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I'm way older than that. But it felt right. And it felt like if at this point in my life I was going to move my family, it had to be for very meaningful work. And for me, the National Civil Rights Museum was that meaningful work. But what was most appealing to me, because I had no experience in museum management. I told you I worked in philanthropy. My undergraduate degree is in journalism. My graduate degree is in organizational communications management. I went to museums all the time. My mom actually worked at, which one was it? No, but in DC. Okay, Detroit, DIA in Detroit, Smithsonian American Art Museum. Never made the connection. Never connected the two that, oh, my mom works in the museum industry. But it wasn't that. It was that when I had a chance to talk with the board, they said, we want to make sure that this museum is relevant. We want to make sure that this history is important to generations to come. And we want to make sure that there is a connection between the people and the museum. Their other concern, frankly, was that there was this institution called the Smithsonian that was building this great big museum in Washington, D.C., the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and they were quite concerned about competition. This was even before they knew about the museum that was coming up in Jackson, Mississippi. So it was about relevance, it was about competition, and I thought, well, as long as you're not looking for someone who is a historian, because I'm not, a curator, because I'm not, or someone who has been in museum administration, then we're good. I can do this job. If you don't want any of that, we're good then. So when I came here, the first thing that I did was I wanted to talk to people who were associated with the museum, those people who were affiliated either on the board, obviously the staff, but also people in the community who had interacted with the museum, nonprofit organizations and what have you. And so I learned a couple of things. I learned that this museum is considered a precious jewel to those people who live in Memphis, but it's also considered a precious jewel to people outside of Memphis, Tennessee. I learned that people who did work in Memphis, particularly on issues that are related to civil and human rights, were very interested in partnering with the museum, but didn't have an opportunity really to do that. I learned that there was a real need to increase local interaction with the museum. The museum's visitorship is about 70% outside of 120 miles away from Memphis, Tennessee. And so the idea was connecting people who live here, and I know what that's like, living in the DC area with all of those museums. You know when we went to the museums? Out-of-town company. Oh, we want to go to the Air and Space Museum. Okay, that sounds like a good idea. And some of them, frankly, I never made it to in over 30 years. So I get it. But if you haven't been to the National Civil Rights Museum, I am giving you a personal invitation to come and have an opportunity to experience the museum. And so in looking at local interaction, we figured, well, a part of that is about seeing the exhibits in the museum, but another is about having programming that will draw people into the museum, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then Otis Samford, early on I spoke at a Rotary, and Otis Samford said, you know, I think that the National Civil Rights Museum can be the new public square. And so I really held on to that and said, yes, that is exactly what we should be. It should be a public square where people feel like this is a place where they can come and they can talk and they feel safe in that space. So given that information, we actually redefined the mission of the National Civil Rights Museum, and it is a fourfold mission. The first is to chronicle the history of the American Civil Rights movement. So, in our exhibits, which we have 23 permanent exhibits, that is what you will see. The second is to examine today's global civil and human rights issues. So, this is directly focused on the relevance of the museum, simply to show what King and James Lawson and Bernard Lafayette and Rosa Parks and others did is not enough if we are not connecting that history, what their role was in American history, to what is happening today, would be to not fully do our job. The third is to provoke thoughtful debate. When I came here, I talked about the museum being this place to have really uncomfortable but necessary conversations. And the fact of the matter is, our country is suffering under the weight of issues that have persisted for so long around race and reconciliation. And the only way we're going to break through that is to talk about it. That's the only way, and it's not a comfortable conversation. I get it. But sometimes it's through that discomfort that we actually grow. We learn something when we have the opportunity to listen to a divergent viewpoint. And that's on both sides. There's, people on the right can learn from people on the left, and people on the left can learn from people on the right. And sometimes the fringes make people come to the center. And so our hope is that the museum can be used in that way by provoking thoughtful debate and then serving as a catalyst for positive social change. Just last week, we issued, and Reverend Webb mentioned it, we issued a report that we commissioned from the University of Memphis on poverty in Memphis over the course of the past 50 years. And while many of us expected what we got, to see it in black and white is sometimes startling. To see that over the course of half a decade, that yes, improvement has been made, progress has occurred, wages have increased, but wages for African Americans have steadily been at 50% of those of whites over a decade. There's been no closing in the gap. So there's been progress, but everybody's progressed, and there's been no closing in the gap. So we want to provide information that then can help people say, okay, what do we need to do in this arena? So how do we chronicle this history, this hallowed history that we have in this place that has such a historical meaning? In fact, just, I guess 2 weeks ago, I can't keep straight all of the events that seem to be occurring as we get closer to April 4th. 2 weeks ago, Governor Haslam and Senator Alexander were in town to announce that the museum is one of 10 sites in Tennessee that make up the U.S. Civil Rights Trail. So there are 10 sites in Tennessee, 3 in Memphis, the museum, Mason Temple, and Claiborne Temple. But then just Friday, when Senator Alexander was back in town with the congressional delegation that did the Faith and Politics tour, he announced that the museum is the first site outside of D.C. on the U.S. Civil Rights Network. So there's only one other site, and it is at the Lincoln Memorial where Marian Anderson actually sang. And now we have the second site, and it is your National Civil Rights Museum. So you should be very proud that we are the first outside of Washington, D.C. So I mentioned to you that I'm not a historian, I'm not a curator, but I do know how to hire good people. So I went and I poached someone who actually had been working as a contract employee at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If I'm going to steal somebody, I need to steal them from the absolute best, right? And she is also what is considered a Frederick Douglass Scholar. So in addition to, she has 3 degrees from Howard University, her bachelor's, master's, and her PhD, all in history. And what she has been able to do with our exhibits and understanding curatorial issues and how we connect educational programs has been just phenomenal. So I'm really thrilled with that hire. And then we have expanded our ability to have traveling exhibits come to the museum. In the renovation that was done in 2014, $27 million invested into the museum to bring it up to 21st century standards. Lots of technology, lots of interaction that I think young people would be interested in. And I'll tell you all, we're going to have next year, don't tell anybody, this is a secret. Okay, next year we're going to have a virtual reality experience in the museum that people can participate in. So I did it, and I thought, well, maybe for older people we need handrails, because I thought I was going to fall over. But it's going to be a fantastic exhibit that allows you to experience what the strikers did during the sanitation strike. And that piece of work is being donated to us by North Carolina State University, so we are thrilled with that, but that won't happen until next year. But we've expanded our use of traveling exhibits. In the renovation, they included a gallery space, and so in that gallery space, we've been able to have all sorts of exhibits, from those that are very historical, like the New Orleans collection that talked about the slave trade that was within the continental U.S., to an exhibit that was called KKK, Kin Killing Kin, which focused on the issue of gun violence. And so we've been able to use this space for some incredible exhibits. And I'm thrilled to say that we are curating our very first traveling exhibit for MLK 50 that will focus on Dr. King's legacy. So it will begin in 1967 and will go all the way up through 2017, 18, I guess. So we're excited about that. So that's how we chronicle. How do we examine? We have every year authors that come in to the museum based on our education staff selection of people, and we have had authors who have written books on passing for white during the early 20th century and how in her family that kind of played out. We've had authors to talk about what I call the real story of the Black Panther Party, what they really stood for versus what the common narrative is. And recently we had a very controversial speaker in Mr. Pepper, who has written a perspective on the assassination of Dr. King and other parties that were involved. So again, it's not necessarily what, we're not trying to present what we believe, right? We're trying to present things that will help you think. That is the whole point of the museum. We've done films and documentaries, which I have to say, over the course of probably about the last 5 years, the documentaries that have been done on issues around civil and human rights have been phenomenal. And the one that I think that I'm most proud of was we presented the film 13th, which is about the 13th Amendment and the fact that, yes, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery with the exception of those who are convicted. And it talked about the labor that the country gets from people who are incarcerated and how on their backs a lot of things are occurring throughout the country. It's a fascinating documentary. You can probably still find it on Netflix. Ava DuVernay is the one who did it. It's long, but it's good. And then we just had a film series at the museum on shorts that were done by local filmmakers on MLK 50 and how they interpreted that. And we had about, I would say about 12 film shorts that range from 6 minutes in length to 14 minutes in length. And it was a fabulous showing. They had been shown at the Indie Film Festival here in Memphis in November, and we just collected all of those and presented them this past week. You see how many things happened this past week. This is why I have a hard time keeping track with everything. And I said if the fire marshal had come into the museum, into the theater, they would have shut everything down. We had so many people in there. It was a packed house for sure. And then again, the use of our traveling exhibits is a way that we examine these issues. Provoking thoughtful debate. So we started a speaker series called the Catalyst for Change series. And the idea is bringing in people who maybe their perspective even doesn't even seem like it fits, frankly, within the realm of what the museum does. We had a gentleman, his name is Dr. Jim Johnson from University of North Carolina, come in. He's a demographer. And so I was telling people, I had heard him several times before, and I'm like, no, really, he's interesting. They were like, a demographer? You're gonna make us sit through a demographer for 2 hours? And I'm like, no, really, he's really interesting. And they were won over by the time we were finished with it. But he talks about the trends that are occurring in our country over the next 20, 25 years. And then he applies that to some of the issues that are facing the country. So he was fascinating. And then this coming week, we are bringing in a young woman. Her name is Amy Liu from the Brookings Institution to talk about inclusive economic growth. And so we're having that event actually out at the Hilton because we really are targeting a business audience. We want folks to look at this issue and why being inclusive in our development is so critical. So we have that. We partner with our local nonprofits on issues as well. So education is a keen issue as it relates to civil rights, because even though we see graduation rates increasing, and Tennessee has done an outstanding job in increasing graduation rates, that's only as good as it is effective when kids go off to college. If they go to college and they can't get through the first year, then something has not been done correctly. So it's great to be able to check the box and say, wow, we've got 85, 90% graduation rate. But if then we only have a fraction of the number of kids who go off to college that actually are able to complete college, it's not a success. And that's what's happening. And here's the deal. This is not a Memphis thing. This is a national thing. It's a national failing around education. And for me, education is one of those things that it can truly be the great equalizer. I am thankful for the incredible education that I got in public schools and private schools in Chicago, in Detroit, but it was a quality education. And unless we are going to be willing to give all children a quality education, we are failing them. That's just the fact. We are failing them. So we got to do a better job when it comes to education. So when you hear people talk about education as the next civil rights challenge, I don't say next, we're there, right? And here's another big thing that I think we have to worry about in the future. The next big bubble to break is going to be student loan debt for kids who have to get loans, and then they go to college and then they can't get a job that allows them to pay off that student loan debt. It's coming not that I want it to happen, but it is going to actually happen. So, and finally, serving as a catalyst. So I talked about our platform for discussion that we provide at the museum. We have a dialogue series that we started this year called Unpacking Racism for Action. And this was really getting at those difficult and tough conversations. So we put out an open application for people. Apply if you're interested in doing it. And we wanted to have facilitated conversations, create a cohort of individuals who would stick together for 6 months. We had about 85 applications. We were able to take about 35 applicants. We're down to about 33 because a couple of people were unable to continue. It's an incredibly diverse group, incredibly diverse in age, in gender. We have a transgender person in the class. We have folks who live all over Memphis, East Memphis, South Memphis, North Memphis, Midtown, the whole everything. And we have really uncomfortable conversations. Now, I don't lead the conversations because that's not me. I manage the museum, that's it. I have a facilitator. Remember, I said I know how to hire people who know how to do this stuff. And so I've hired a wonderful woman who used to work at the Ford Foundation to do these conversations. And really, last week, this month will be the last month of the conversations. And last month we had a young woman say, you know, I'd never been very involved in the voting process. But through what I've learned in this group, I'm going to start creating opportunities to sit around with women and support women candidates that want to run for elective office. From my perspective, that's a win. I wanted people to do something when they come out of this, and so we have been able to do that. And then I talked about the poverty report that we just commissioned, and if you're interested in that report, it is on our website, mlk50.civilrightsmuseum.org. So let's fast forward to MLK 50, and I'm going to give you some time for questions if you have it. I was really inspired by Dr. King's writings, and not the ones that we're so familiar with, not the mountaintop speech, not the I have a dream speech, not the stuff that immediately pops up, but the other writings. And I think a part of what drew me to the theme that we chose was that it was this open-ended question on the final book that Dr. King wrote that he never had a chance to read, because by the time it was published, he had been assassinated. And the title of that book is Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And I read the speech of the same name that he gave in '67 at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference 10th anniversary convention. And I was intrigued by the speech, so I said, let me go ahead and read the book. And for me, the book was almost prophetic. I felt as though Dr. King was down the street somewhere watching what was going on in our nation and saying, we haven't done enough. We've had some successes, but we got so much more to do. And in particular, his emphasis was on what he came to Memphis for, which was to have this campaign for the Poor People's Campaign. That in fact, in a country that he felt was so rich, and we know is so rich, that the fact that people were struggling and that there were two worlds that were being created was just unfathomable to him. He said, and I'll paraphrase, what good is it if a man can sit, or woman, man or woman can sit at a lunch counter, but they can't afford a hamburger? And that was where he was headed. It was all about people being able to just live. And I tell people all the time, I've never really run into anybody who said, when I grow up, I want to be poor. That's never been the answer. I've never run into anybody who said, when I grow up, I want to be criminal. I've never run into anybody like that. People want to be able to live. So we got to be able to figure out how we make sure that people can. And that's where he was coming from. I was also inspired as we looked at this 50th anniversary, because 50 years is pretty doggone significant, right? I had a big party on my 50th birthday. I don't know about you all, but I had a blowout. Actually, I didn't. I had to work. We had a big gala at the Community Foundation that night, and I had to spend it with 400 of my closest friends, or not. But I had fun afterwards. I was inspired by what were we seeing happen? What was happening in the community of people that Dr. King worked so hard for? We were seeing police brutality. We were seeing riots that looked like the same pictures that we saw in 1964 and 65 and 66. There was a split cover. It was either Newsweek or Time that asked the question, what year is it? Is it 1965, 66, or is it 2016, 17? And so these issues, Charleston, where a gunman walks into a church where our churches are no longer safe and killed so many innocent people who were looking at Jesus' word, right? To the local bridge incident here, where young people just said, look, we got to make a statement. We're going to take over this bridge. To Charlottesville, which was very scary to know that, You know, it's one thing if you're wearing a sheet. It's a whole nother issue when you're wearing a polo shirt. And it's just some scary stuff that we're seeing that makes you ask the question, so, you know, where are we? So, where do we go from here? That's the theme of MLK 50. And the question is posed not by me, but by Dr. King. It's his title. And I think it's for all of us to answer. There's no right answer or wrong answer. Well, it's a wrong answer if you say backwards. That's not where we need to go. We need to move forward, and we need to recognize that forward is going to require something of us. And the other thing that I say about this theme is that if, in fact, we're looking forward, that means that we're not looking at people who are over the age of 35 to get us there. We're looking at young people. This is not it's our fight, but our fight is to support young people. Not to tell them how to do it, but to help guide them, to be supportive, to give guidance as necessary. But it's going to be young people who do this because, frankly, it was young people that did it in the 60s. Dr. King was 26 years old when he got into the movement in Montgomery, Alabama. And he was 39 years old when he was assassinated. We tend to forget that because they were so much more formal than we are nowadays. They always had on dresses and heels and suits, but they were young people. The sit-in movement, the freedom rides, they were college students who made a decision that this was important, not just for them, but for the whole. And just like we're seeing in Parkland, Florida, with high school students, they've said, you know what? Adults are motivated by money, but we're not. We're motivated by emotion, and we're mad. I'll say this, I know I'm in the church. We're mad as hell, and we're going to do something about it. And I do hope that those young people stick in there for whatever outcome that we can get. But it's so important for us to say to these young people, yes, it is your turn. Yes, we're going to let you do this. And yes, frankly, we're going to admit that we haven't done the best job that we could have done. We've let you down in some ways. So how do we honor Dr. King's question of where do we go from here? And let me just say, this is not about the assassination. Everybody knows what happened April 4th, 1968. We don't need to rehash that. In fact, by saying he was assassinated, it's done, right? So we know what happened in 68. But what we want to talk about is the legacy that Dr. King has left with us through the questions that, frankly, he poses to us in that narrative. So what we have been doing is engaging young people, engaging clergy, engaging scholars in this question and allowing them to talk about it the way that they want to. We have encouraged the broader community to think about this theme, and we've also asked the nation to focus on the relevance of King's message today. We really are focused on economic equity, jobs, housing, education. And some of the ways we've talked about this to date have been through a youth conference that was held in November with Bridges organization, a poetry slam that we hosted in the summertime of 2017 with the theme, where do we go from here? Gosh, there are some really talented young people out there. A Moral Mondays program that the clergy have organized. They've had 2 meetings, and the third will be on Monday, March 12th at Temple Israel. With the main speaker is a woman, Reverend Tracy Blackman, out of St. Louis, who was very involved in Ferguson's uprising. We've had MLK 50 film series that I mentioned, the Poverty Report. We've developed with our clergy a Lenten lectionary. I had never heard the term lectionary. My husband is a pastor. I should know this stuff, right? But I had never heard the term. He's like, yes, that's what you use. It's a whole syllabus on what. Oh, so I was like, okay, well, so there has been developed a Lenten lectionary with topics over the course of Lent that can be used, songs, all sorts of readings, as well as an outline for sermons for pastors. We have a series of MLK 50 blogs that are posted on our website that have been written by scholars across the country on issues of import to Dr. King at the time of his death, and questions, frankly, that are asked through these blogs of us. I mentioned this MLK 50 legacy exhibit that we will be having, And then on the 2nd and 3rd of April this year, we will host, in partnership with the University of Memphis Law School, a symposium, a 2-day symposium to deal with some of the topics that we have talked about. They will have a keynote speaker on Monday the 2nd. Eric Holder will be at the Peabody. It's sold out, sorry. And then on Tuesday, we will have a keynote with Taylor Branch, who is a scholar of King's writings at the University of Memphis. Holiday Inn is where our luncheon will be on the 3rd. And then on the 4th, we will have a day of remembrance, because that is the actual day of the 50th anniversary. At 3:30, we will begin what is actually our usual event. Every April 4th, we have a commemoration at the National Civil Rights Museum, and we switch out the wreath and lay a new wreath and have a guest speaker. I just described that this year's will be on steroids. There's going to be lots of talking heads, I'm sorry, but they call every day, so where am I going to be on the program? And now I'm at a point where I'm saying, well, you're not. But please join us if you would. But it's going to be a very meaningful program. And I think the piece that I'm most proud of, in addition to the message that I think we're going to focus on around faith and justice and peace, will be that at 6:01, the time when the shot rang out, we will have a bell tolling as opposed to a moment of silence, which we typically do. And the bells will begin to ring at the museum at 6:01. Claiborne Temple has generously allowed us to move their bell to the museum and ring that bell, and that will have huge significance for the event. But at 6:03, we have asked bell towers in Memphis to begin to ring. And at 6:05, we have asked bell towers across the nation to begin to ring. And at 6:07, we have asked bell towers across the globe to begin to ring. And I can't tell you how gratifying it is for me to get emails from people who say, I have an international network, please provide me with the information. They would love to participate. So while I won't be able to hear it all around the globe, I guarantee you that if you're somewhere between 6:01 and 6:07 on April 4th, you will hear bells, and they will ring 39 times for the number of years that Dr. King will. April. I'm sorry. April 4th, 39 times. And we are just really, really encouraged by the response we have gotten to this very simple way of acknowledging a moment in time that changed our nation. So, and then April 5th comes and I pass out. So that is how we hope to commemorate this very, very great man who was a significant historic figure, not just to Memphis, but to the world. And it is our hope that people will say, okay, it's been 50 years. Where are we and where do we go from here? And begin to work on that. Thank you very much. Now, I've been asked to take some questions. I've been told I have like 10 minutes for questions. So, yes, sir. Well, I do agree. First off, if you can't read, life is over, basically. I mean, if you can't read, you really cannot interact, right, in life. But how should a child be able to get through high school and not be able to read? That's the question that we have to ask, right? How does that happen? And so, something's wrong, right? Something's wrong in the academic equation. And so I agree. We know that children must be able to read by 3rd grade, period. They have to be able to read. Well, they're incredible, like my grandson will be. No, I'm just, But my point being, no child should be allowed to go beyond third grade and not read. And so that is not a failing of the young people. But what I've come to the conclusion of, there are no failings of young people except adults. Adults fail young people. And so if the adults would do the job that they have to do, which is to teach young people to read, and frankly, as much as parents are their first teachers, parents aren't always equipped to teach. So we need our teachers, and this is not at all an indictment of teachers. I love teachers. My grandmother was my fourth grade teacher. All three of her sisters were teachers. So I love teachers. But we do have to focus on, I think, the basics. Reading being the first one. Because if you can't read, you can't connect. Yes, ma'am.
So I visited the museum yesterday with my 5-year-old for homework, and tonight he'll draw to leave the museum with, and not to be reflected with them.
Well, I think it's important. Well, one of the things, especially if you're with your children, is to impress upon them how young people were who were really in this struggle for rights and freedom and justice. When you get to the Birmingham area with the Birmingham jail and the pictures of the hoses, and that was a children's crusade. That was a children's campaign. They made the decision to use children because adults had pretty much decided after the first attempt that they weren't willing to do it any longer, and the kids were. And the kids then garnered all of that media. And it was because of that media that the world the next day learned what was going on in Birmingham and across the South. So one is that they're never too young to do something, right? The second, for me, is to really don't call this African American history, because it's not. It's American history. The civil rights movement was a part of America, and we have to call it what it is. History isn't always pleasant, right? Slavery is a part of America. It wasn't a part of African. In fact, we weren't even African Americans. We were Africans, right? So we have to call this what it is, and it's American history. I guess the third thing would be that every one of the people that's pictured in there, even Dr. King, even Rosa Parks, were just ordinary people who made a decision to do extraordinary things, and that they have nothing that we don't have within us. Each one of us have the exact same stuff that they had, but it's just a matter of whether or not we make a decision. And I always tell people, doesn't mean that you always have to be on the front line. Somebody had to make sandwiches for everybody who was marching, and that was their contribution. So those are the things that I think I would have you take away. Yes, sir. Well, you know, it's interesting. Let me talk about that a little bit, because there's a theory called the broken windows theory. Have you heard of that? That if we allow windows to be broken and we don't fix them, that more windows will be broken. And just think about that. Think about what happens in East Memphis versus what happens in North and South Memphis. Think about where, and again, please don't take this as any indictment. I'm just speaking on what people's experience is. If you have a pothole in a street that doesn't get fixed, what happens to the pothole? It gets bigger and bigger, and eventually it starts swallowing up cars, right? That's exactly the same thing that trash in a neighborhood does, broken windows, and it tells something to the people who live in that about their worth. I had to correct someone who was African American, who was talking about a neighborhood, and I don't really know the neighborhoods yet that well here in Memphis. Was talking about a neighborhood that he grew up in Memphis and how it had changed over time, and frankly, you know, how awful it was. And I pulled him aside and I said, but that's still home to certain people. You don't get to talk about their home that way. You wouldn't want people to talk about your home that way. So you don't get to say that. We have to be uplifting in the things that we say about people. And please, whatever you all do, don't take at full face value what you hear on the nightly news, okay? Please. I must admit, I don't really, I watch the news for the weather, because that's important. But in moving here, I have been totally astonished at the negativity of the news media here. It is like a constant, I'm afraid to walk out my door if I look at what the news has on. And we got to get away from that. And but that's all you hear, and that's not all that happens. So that's my admonition to you. I can take one more question. Yes, sir.
It just occurred to me, where would I go to find out the truth?
Well, you know, one of his greatest inspirations was Gandhi, and so I would encourage you to read Gandhi's writings. Here's what's so interesting. I do think that I didn't mention this. So one of the things that we are pulling together, this is my historian, because when she was talking about it, I'm like, huh? But she says, we're going to do a MLK 50 syllabus. And I'm like, okay, what's that mean? And she said, well, it's going to have writings and films and resources. So it is not complete yet. Once it is complete, it will go up on our website, and that will at least be a start. One of the things that I've learned is that, and as much as I'd like to say that I read all the time, I don't, because I'm tired. Well, because I do. I read emails all the time, and so I'm tired by the time I get home. But in reading, especially when you're reading nonfiction, you always get more resources on where else to read. And so I've found that I can build my reading list off of what I am currently reading, but I would encourage you to read those things that are both historic in their content and contemporary to bring the two together. And shameless plug, and my mom volunteers in our museum shop 3 days a week. And she calls me up and says, do you know that the museum is doing such and such? And I'm like, well, I kind of work there. I know you don't see me every day, but I do kind of work there. But we have fabulous books. Now, I think she has every book, almost. And she's probably read more of them than I have. But we do have a fabulous collection of books that relate not just to King, but to the entire movement, and some that are more contemporary. In fact, when Taylor Branch is in town, because you know he did those 3 huge volumes on King's life, he will be doing a book signing outside of the Rose Theater on the 3rd when he is here with us. So, but I would encourage you, come down to the museum. You don't have to go through the museum to go into the museum shop. And we do have really incredible. Did you go to the museum shop? Really good stuff, right? Yeah. So that would be my suggestion. Thank you all so much for your attention. I'm so appreciative.